Hi everyone, it's Volunteer Haylan here at the Lost Pines Complex at Bastrop and Bisher State Parks. And today, I'm glad you tuned in because we're going to talk about an American legend, that's Smokey Bear, and how fire affects our forests here and around the whole country. Now, when I grew up, Smokey Bear was a household name. He was on the TV, he was on billboards, we had toys of him, but not everyone is so familiar with who Smokey Bear is and what his origin story is, and really what his message is. So even if you're really familiar with Smokey Bear and you grew up seeing him the way that I did, you may be surprised to learn about his roots, that Smokey Bear was a very real bear. He first appeared in August of 1944. This was the first image of Smokey Bear produced by the Forest Service. Now, it wasn't until 1947 that his more famous tagline appeared, "Only you can prevent forest fires." It took a few more years after that something very sad but very beautiful happened that would change everything. On a spring day in 1950, a wildfire was reported in the Lincoln National Forest near Capitan, New Mexico. And several crews responded, including civilians, to find a fire blazing the countryside. Now, this fire was so bad that 30 members of this crew actually got trapped by the fire and had to lay face down on a rock slide for more than an hour while the fire burned past them. Little did they know that a black bear who had been separated from its mother was experiencing a very similar situation. The baby black bear hid inside a burned and charred tree trying to escape the flames. But luckily, this bear survived, and the firefighters found and retrieved the baby bear. When they rescued the bear, they discovered it had been burned on his feet. All 4 of them were badly injured, so he was taken into care by a local veterinarian. It took a village to rehabilitate this bear. And as you can see through these very real images of that real baby Smokey, he pulled at the American public's heartstrings. You can guess that the news spread like wildfire, and the American public across the country was enamored with this adorable baby bear. This is an image from the Smokey Bear comic book. It's his origin story. If you stop by a Forest Service office, you might be able to get a free copy. I would recommend it. It tells his whole story and it's really adorable. I will be honest with you, I cry every time I read it. But this is a picture, a drawing of baby Smokey being rehabilitated. You can actually find this, it's a real photo as well. They really did spoon feed this baby bear. Now, because of the extent of Smokey's injuries, and because he had had so much human contact, he could not be rehabilitated back into the forest and released. Instead, the Forest Service decided they would use this baby bear as the living image of the Smokey Bear idea they had come up with before. Hence, Smokey Bear was officially born. And because he had become so popular and was to be throughout his life the living image of conservation and wildfire, they decided to fly him all the way across the country to his new forever home at the Washington, D.C. National Zoo, where he lived out his entire life in style and comfort. In fact, he was so popular throughout his lifetime there at the zoo, and he got so many letters just like these you see written from his fans. He actually had to have his own zip code. He got more letters than the President of the United States. This was a very, very popular and very loved bear. Now here I'll share with you my very favorite picture I found in all of the internet, because this baby bear you see here with Smokey actually mirrors Smokey's story in an eerie way. This was a female cub found a few years ago in Colorado, you guessed it, during a wildfire. She had finally been rescued while clinging to, you guessed it, a charred and burning tree. And just like Smokey, all of her feet were burned. But she was taken in just like Smokey was, but we've actually come a long way. And this female cub was rehabilitated with very little human contact, and since then has actually been successfully released back into the wild. So we really have come a long way, but Smokey's story still resonates with all of us. Now, since his time in the Washington, D.C. Zoo until modern times, he still has a message that you'll see on commercials, maybe on billboards, and you will see Smokey visit in person to different parks, maybe events in your community. He even has a historic site and museum in New Mexico. Now, since Smokey's time, when he was here inaugurated into the National Zoo there in Washington, D.C., he's had a lot to learn, and his message has had to adapt to cater to the new knowledge we get when we study wildfires, when we learn about forest and ecology. And parks like the Lost Pines, national parks, forests, we've all had to learn with Smokey Bear and change the way we look at fire. For a long time, both Smokey and the park system, we all thought that all wildfires were bad and needed to be suppressed and put out no matter how they started and no matter where they were burning. But because we've paid attention, we've learned that that's not really the case, and both us and Smokey have had to change and adapt our message to fit with facts. You may remember that I mentioned Smokey's original motto was "Only you can prevent forest fires." But pretty recently it's actually changed to "Only you can prevent wildfires." And that was important because we realized that one message made it clear that only forest fires, fires in a forest, were bad and they needed to be stopped. But wildfires is more appropriate. It means that our plains and prairies, our swamps, every type of landscape can actually be affected by wildfire in good and bad ways. So we've had to adapt to communicate that in our message. So you may have heard me mention that there's a couple different types of wildfire that we've had to learn about. One would be natural caused wildfire, and one would be a human caused wildfire. So think about it a moment. Tell me what you can think of that would cause a natural wildfire. And I can almost guarantee that most of you thought lightning, which is in fact the #1 cause of natural wildfire. So what if I ask you the same question, but what would you think would cause a human caused fire? And you probably have a lot more answers, right? Humans can cause fires by not putting out their campfire or their fire pit at home. Maybe they don't monitor their burn pile. Maybe they parked on dry grass. There's lots of ways that you can probably run through your head that humans could cause fires accidentally. So when we learn about these two types of wildfires, it's important to think about that suppression I mentioned, how for such a long time we all thought that all fire was bad and it needed to be suppressed. And that means once we knew it was there, we'd rush out and put it out no matter what. Since then, we've learned that fire plays a natural, necessary, and really important role in all ecosystems. Fire's been around longer than our campfires and longer than our cars, longer than us. So nature has learned how to work with it in a positive way and in a tolerant way, so it's just like any other natural part of the environment. Now, what litter may mean is when a forest or any natural area is going through its natural cycle, it's ready to be burned at some point. But when we suppress fires, all of the tree branches and vegetation and other matter that's built up ready to burn doesn't get burned and gets deeper and deeper, causing an unnatural level of fuel for a fire that will eventually arrive, natural or not. And when we have fires like that burn, they're very deep and destructive, very uncontrollable. They can take out 96% of our parks. They can destroy homes, facilities, historic facilities like we have here in these parks. They can be very destructive, and even if we wanted to put them out, it may not be so easy. But if we had let natural fire take its course during that time, it's safe to say the destruction would not have been so broad. You'll notice that Smokey's message shifted in another way as well. It really started being directed towards human-caused fires. You've probably heard Smokey say that 9 out of 10 forest fires are human-caused. That means whatever number of natural fires we have, 9 out of 10, it's been extremely expanded to be way more fire than is natural for our land to tolerate. That means areas, animals, and plants are being burned far more often than they should, and that leads me back to the destructive fires that we just talked about. So just like back in 1950, in modern times, we have different crews of firefighters. Here in the park with Texas Forest Service and lots of other agencies. They basically serve to see what happened when a fire started. Was it natural? Was it accidental? Was it human caused? Where is the fire? How big is it? All of these questions are important to understand if this is a fire we should go out and put out and suppress immediately, control the boundaries of and let it burn a little, or is it a fire that we should just let take its natural course for the land? Now there's actually another type of wildfire called a prescribed or controlled burn. This is when a land management agency like Texas Parks and Wildlife understands that an area is ready for its natural burn in its cycle of life. The firefighters will go out with special tools and special knowledge and start the fire on purpose using controlled equipment in a surveyed area. This means that the area can burn safely while being monitored while still getting the natural burn that it probably should have had quite a long time ago. It helps us keep park buildings, historic properties, homes, neighborhoods. It is basically a safe way to make sure a fire still does its job in nature, and the land, the animals, everyone can benefit from that. Now, to some people, it does sound kind of scary and definitely bizarre to talk about how we let some wildfires burn and how we actually purposefully start and control others. So it's important to know, why are these fires good for the land? Why is it something that we need to have happen? And when you understand it better, it kind of puts you at rest just a little bit. So this is my favorite Smokey campaign. This is the Babes in the Woods campaign. Clearly, again, it was meant to pull at the heartstrings of the American public, seeing these adorable coons and these adorable forest critters that you don't want to destroy with an accidental or destructive wildfire. So these babes in the woods, these is probably one of the reasons you come to visit your local park or forest. Here in Bastrop and Bisher, you can surely see some really adorable animals that we don't want to see harmed by fire, but it's important too to understand that almost all of them have some reliance on fire for their life cycle or life, or they've grown tolerant and use wildfire to their advantage in some ways. So let's take a look at a few of these animals, and not all of them are babes or cuddly, but they're just important to our ecosystem no matter what. To start off with one that's a little bit controversial. That's a different type of fire beetles or bark beetles, pine beetles. They're all over the country in some form or the other. This is a picture of a black fire beetle. These are really interesting because they actually have this amazing superpower where they can detect a wildfire from over a mile away using infrared sensors. Now that's really impressive when you consider that they're no bigger than a grain of rice. And what happens is when they sense these wildfires, they zoom right over to it. They want a still smoking, still warm tree trunk. They will use that infrared sensor to actually land on a place where they've gauged with their sensor that it's safe to land on. They can check temperature, and then they start their life cycle. They burrow beneath the tree bark. That's where they lay their eggs, and the life cycle begins. Some of these beetles can't do that without these burned forests, and you'll see where they come into play with some other animals we'll talk about as well. The reason I say these are controversial is because they get a bad rap. Pine beetles, fire beetles, bark beetles, they do cause a lot of damage, but it's important to remember that even animals like this that we've come to think of as pests do serve a purpose in the environment they're native in. They're part of the life cycle and important to the place they're supposed to be. The issue is that sometimes these beetles have been carried in different ways to infect and become invasive or non-native in an area where they're not supposed to be. So we don't have some of the most destructive ones like they do in the western states. They're not native here and they haven't been brought here. One thing you can do is always remember to get firewood locally. You don't want to take your firewood from home when you travel a distance to camp somewhere, because you could be taking something like one of those beetles, oak wilt, different types of fungus that when you burn your wood at your campsite, it can actually release those things and wreak havoc in the new area where it's not native or hasn't been spread to. That's just one way you can help us kind of protect our parks and forests by not spreading. Make sure you're buying it from the park store or maybe a local business that's selling local firewood. So these beetles, it's important to their life cycle. In fact, it's intrinsical to their life cycle that they arrive in these burned areas to start their cycle of life. And they do serve as one of the first colonizers of burned areas to restart the cycle to regrow the forest. So they're more important than you might think. We just want them to stay where they belong. Now, if we move on from the beetle and look at woodpeckers, we see the next step in the cycle. Throughout the country, there are woodpeckers like the black-backed woodpecker, or here in Texas, the red cockaded woodpecker, amongst many others that are drawn to a wildfire burn. Sometimes with the black-backed woodpecker, you'll be hard-pressed to see them outside of a burned area. And it's because of critters like the beetle that draws them there. It is basically an all-you-can-eat buffet, because it's not just the beetles that are laying their eggs and living in those burned areas, it's all sorts of insects that are attracted to those areas, meaning the woodpeckers follow because that's where they can get their food. Now, a single woodpecker can actually eat more than 13,000 larvae and beetles in just a year. And once those beetles start growing up and leaving, the woodpeckers do too. They go on to the next burned area, remaining basically colonizers of these freshly burned areas. That lets the next part of the cycle for the forest continue in recovery of a healthy forest with fresh regrowth. Now, since we're on the subject of birds, there's been one around here in Bisher and Bastrop State Parks that I've seen a lot lately. That's the mountain bluebird. They're really adorable, pretty small. Mostly the males are blue with a little bit of ruddy red here. They're really, really beautiful birds. Now, they like to live and build their nests inside holes of trees, but since they're not a woodpecker, they can't really build those holes themselves. They're way too tiny and they have a little bitty beak. So they do rely on those woodpeckers. They follow them to burned areas after the fact when the woodpeckers have left and take over the holes that they've drilled. That's where they build their nest, and then all of the next generation of bugs to move into a regrowth area of a forest after the beetles and woodpeckers have left, the mountain bluebirds are going to be eating. Now, this little thing would never be considered a babe of the wood. It's pretty creepy, it's pretty ugly, but that doesn't make it any less important than adorable animals like the mountain bluebird. This is one type of morel mushroom, and some of these grow in Texas, some of them grow different places depending on the species. One of the more interesting ones for fire is the black morel mushroom. Now, these are not just important to fire ecology in our environment, but people really love these. They're pretty pricey, they're considered a delicacy, and everyone I've ever talked to that's tried these says they're delicious. I can't vouch, but maybe you can leave a comment if you tried them and tell me how delicious they are. And much like the beetle, their entire life cycle actually depends on a forest fire's existence. After a fire, these black morel mushrooms will pop up. They're kind of always alive under the surface, but they will only pop up after a wildfire. And if there's not another one for 100 years, those morels will not pop back up in the meantime. Now, they're going to serve for different types of food and biomass for our land. And of course, as you've heard, they're pretty popular with people as well. So that's just a taste of how wildfire here in Texas, or really anywhere, serves kind of like a checks and balances system for our ecosystem. For our famous loblolly pines here, it's a little bit important because these wildfires come through and will actually remove the hard wood that will encroach on and overtake our famous loblolly pines. You can kind of think of this like your haircut you would get. You need a haircut every once in a while so it doesn't get out of control, and of course you wash your hair to keep it healthy, and that's kind of the same thing a wildfire is doing for our forests here and anywhere. So you've seen just a small selection of some of the wildlife and plants and fungi that could be attracted to a burned area, and that list could go on because almost every animal and plant has adapted to tolerate or use wildfire in some way that keeps the ecosystem healthy. It could be anything from the tiniest deer mouse that uses it for a buffet. It could be white-tailed deer, or historically bison or antelope that should be native here that have learned to use fire not only when it's regenerating, where there's lots of good nutrients in a food, especially for pregnant and nursing mothers, but throughout a forest's whole life cycle until it's ready to burn again. Things like keeping safe from predators during certain times of the year is important in the cycle of a forest from wildfire to another wildfire. Basically, with Smokey Bear, we've also had to adapt the way that we think about fire and understanding how very important it is, because Texas state parks have really learned that the lack of fire can really degrade a habitat and cause us a lot more trouble down the line. So it's better for us, wildlife species, all of the environment, the trees, the plants, everything, if we really understand fire and don't look at it as just an enemy. We don't want to suppress it. We want to let it do its job. And the list of plants and animals that require fire or have become tolerant of it in some way really goes on. I've only mentioned a fraction of them. Other places it could be like ponderosa pine, our wild turkeys here at Bisher, white bark pine, and Clark's nutcracker. Those are two of the most interesting fire-dependent species. So I encourage you to learn more just about how fascinating everything is and how well it's all connected. Now, when Smokey Bear tells us to be careful with fire, we understand that we don't want too much of it. Just like with most things, too much is a bad thing. But what natural fire is very important to us, and it helps us keep safe and healthy as well. We don't want to destroy our beautiful forests and our parkland. We don't want fire to be too widespread because it could do that too. It's about learning the balance and really understanding the benefits and the dangers of fire and what we can do to be a healthy part of that. Now, there are definitely some things you can do if you want to help Smokey out in not causing any accidental human-caused fire. Of course, number one is make sure if you're camping or if you have a fire pit at home, you put it out the proper way and completely have it out cold before you go inside, go to the tent at night, or go for a hike in the morning. Always make sure it's cold to the touch before you depart. Another thing is be mindful of burn bans. We have one here right now because we've seen that the lack of rain, wind, the dryness of the grass means that a fire will be too dangerous to have for a campfire or even at home. Now, even though it just rained yesterday, the grass is still too dry to really lower the fire risk. Another thing to keep in mind would be to not park a hot car on grass. Always use parking spots, because when a hot car pulls onto grass, that even caused a fire here this last month. And if you pull a trailer, make sure your chains never drag the ground. We've had instances of wildfire on the side of the highway near the park where people are dragging chains, and it sparked up to 9 fires on the side of the road just from that single chain being dragged. Now, paying attention to these things is really important because each one of us makes a difference. If 9 out of 10 wildfires are caused by humans and we each start paying attention, that number can definitely be lowered, and Smokey will thank you for that. So Smokey has taught us about fire ecology. He's adapted over the years to change how we look at things. He's taught us about these babes in the woods. He really helps us as park rangers or volunteers or just visitors to the parks about what can happen when we all pitch in, learn a little bit, and pay attention, because it really can make a really big difference. It'll help our environment, and in turn, that really does help us. Remember, this very year, this very month of August, Smokey Bear actually turned 76 years old. And that's a very long time of helping us learn about wildfire prevention, conservation, and some of the good wildfire can do as well. So if you're out and about at a local neighborhood event, or maybe at a park like this one, you see Smokey Bear, give him a high five and tell him thank you for all that help he's given us. In the meantime, I'd like to thank you as our visitor and viewer online for coming and joining me for this program today. We always appreciate you taking a little bit of time to learn about your local park, your land, and all of our lives. So thank you so much. Until next time, I'll see you then.